Gentlemen,
can I please have your attention? Can you dig it?
Hello, I am not Jonah Goldberg. I'm Chris Stirewalt, but you knew that already because of my irrationally cheerful introduction. But this is the Remnant, a product of the Dispatch and Dispatch Media, and Jonah Goldberg is on a much-deserved vacation, so I will be his stand-in. Now, when we think about how data journalism screwed up journalism and politics, and how politics and the news business screwed up the way that we understand data, it's important to remember that there are people who can navigate these difficult shoals, who can pass through these difficult waters with ease because they have self-reference, a deep understanding of data, a deep understanding of American politics, and humility. So who would I be describing? What person could I be describing? None other than Harry Enten. You see him constantly on CNN, where he is providing context and data about how Americans live, work, play, vote, do whatever they do. Formerly of 538, always a New Yorker at his very core. The world's youngest 90-year-old man, Harry Enten. Welcome back to the Dispatch podcast, The Remnant. Shalom, my friend.
Shalom. It's always a pleasure to be with such an esteemed gentleman such as yourself.
That is not true, but I will take it. I will. As I have always tried to do in my career, is I will take all of the undeserved gets, because you also have to take all of the undeserved don'ts. I don't want to start with a gotcha question, and I don't want to practice this kind of ambush journalism, Harry, but I have to ask. Readers have complained about your soda takes. The last time that you were on, you had, and I think of you as maybe the reigning diet soft drink, zero sugar soft drink expert in America. And you recommended the Maine Root Cola diet at, was it Union Station or Penn Station?
It was Union Station, the Cava at Union Station. And, a funny thing happened when I went back there recently, a few months ago, and I tried it again, and it wasn't nearly as good. And I think I fell folly to something that once occurred to me at the ABC News cafeteria. And that is that the fountain itself, the hoses in the fountain were misappropriated, whereby in the ABC News cafeteria one time, I was like, man, this Diet Coke is really good. It's like the best Diet Coke I've ever had. And finally, I figured out what was going on was that they had switched up the regular Coke and the Diet Coke hose.
And this is my phobia around Coke Zero. Coke Zero is such a good product, and when you get a good fountain Coke Zero, right, with the correct size ice, and you're really living the dream, you think, no, this is just a regular Coke. And of course, if you ask the waiter or waitress, if you say, "Are you sure?" Not only are you now a total loser, who is like concerned about drinking one Coke, and it's like really fatty. But not only that, but also, what are they going to say? Oh, let us go back and check the wires. We will get our team of specialists on it. You know what they're going to say every time? No, it's Coke Zero. You're fine. It's like the regular decaf lie that I watch people talk to waiters. Are you sure that's the decaf? Hold on. We got to get our boys in the lab on it. No, it checks out. It checks out.
They're going to CSI that. And I think that the Cava might have been suffering from that same issue. I still think it's pretty decent, but it wasn't nearly as good as it used to be. So I apologize if I misled your listeners. I will say on the soda front that I found there's a Brooklyn Fair near me. It's a supermarket here in New York City, a Brooklyn Fair near me, and they have constant sales, and so I've been able to get 12 packs of my favorite, my Diet A&W or A&W Zero Sugar Cream Soda, which I used to never be able to get. I've been able to get 12 packs of those for about $6 a piece, which is an amazingly good deal in New York. And last time I went, literally this past Saturday, I got 12 packs for $6 a piece. And they have a rule there where if you leave your ID, you can bring the cart with you. So obviously in New York,
What kind of a zombie apocalypse hellscape do you live in? I have to leave my driver's license with you that I can take a shopping cart into a grocery store?
No, they can take the shopping cart home with me.
Oh.
And so I was able just to drink, because otherwise I'm not carrying 3 cases. And I also, just so we're clear, Chris, I also got a 12-pack of the root beer zero sugar A&W to mix it up, to mix it up a little.
I think about my 12 packs in the fridge constantly, mostly sparkling water. But I got to tell you, coming to you from the Appalachian side of the soda divide, the wonderful, now almost universal prevalence of Diet Sunkist or Sunkist Zero has just really, it's taken me where I want to be. It's got sweet taste, but the delicious caffeine that my bad sleep habits crave. Okay, so the Republican Party has some sodas to pick. The Republican Party has to choose a beverage. And there's a fascinating social psychological experiment going on, which is every Republican, including everybody who is not a Trump supporter from Jump Street, and let's call that, of the potential electorate, 30-40% of the Republican Party, right?
Yeah, depending on the poll, that seems like a very reasonable
something
estimate.
Like a third or so, maybe more, maybe less, depending on
a third to 2/5,
yeah,
somewhere in that range.
Okay, so for everybody but them, they seem to be settling on what the premise of the election is, which is they want to avoid the mistakes of 2016 and have a overly divided field and have the 60 to 66% of the electorate that would prefer a candidate other than Trump from staying divided and letting Trump go through. Mitt Romney has expressly now made the argument, has said, I think Donald Trump's the most likely nominee. And he describes a repeat of a scenario, by the way, that he helped contribute to in 2016 when he said, vote for anybody but Trump. Who? I don't know. Maybe it's Kasich. Maybe it's Cruz. However you feel. It depends on the state you live in. I don't want to say. But anyway, talk to us about the social psychology of this. Talk to us about how you see the lay of the land for Republicans trying to sort this out.
I mean, I think Republicans might have already sorted it out. Look, we still got about a year, depending on when ultimately New Hampshire decides to go, to jumpstart everybody and make sure it's the first primary in the nation, even on the Democratic side. But we'll say we have roughly a year, probably a little bit less, until the first votes are cast or the first people caucus. And you're exactly right. Trump gets about a third to 2/5 of the vote. And right now, it seems like Republicans have settled on Ron DeSantis, most of them, as the alternative. This is the first time since the 1980 Democratic field in which we have 2 candidates who are polling north of 30% this early on. Everyone else is way back. Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, Ted Cruz, all in single digits, and those tend to be the 3 who tend to be 3, 4, and 5. They seem to have already made that decision. And it's so interesting, if you look at the polling, right, I think there's this whole idea that Ron DeSantis is, the candidate who has tried to almost out-Trump Trump in certain ways, right? Take up these cultural conservative issues, which I separate out from the social conservative issues.
Well, hold on. Well, what do you mean? How do you divide a cultural issue from a social issue?
I would say, for example, when I think of social conservatism, I may think of abortion, for example. That's an issue. Versus cultural conservatism, I may think of, I want America to go back to the way it once was, this kind of, fine, America of the 1950s, whatever that means to different people.
So one is, when you think of some issues, you think about specific issues on debates, and then one is more of an attitudinal, sort of the way Trump brought, I think, the most underappreciated line of Trump's in terms of his success and how he displayed these shibboleths that you're talking about was, we're going to make them say Merry Christmas again.
Yes.
We're going to make them say, who are you going to force Starbucks? Are you as president going to order a military strike against Starbucks if they don't put the Christmas trees back on the cups? Okay. I think I got your difference.
Yeah. I think the only other way I might put it is, like George W. Bush, right, who I think most people would acknowledge as a social conservative, Also immigration doesn't necessarily fall neatly into one of those categories. And I think that obviously was a big part of Trump's 2016 campaign. You've seen DeSantis try and sort of, quote unquote, own the issue when it comes to the migrants that are coming up, from the South, whether that be Central South America or the Caribbean. Either way, so if you look, though, at DeSantis's support amongst different parts of the Republican electorate, he doesn't really have a large ideological gap between the moderates,
right,
the somewhat conservatives, and the very conservatives. He tends to be fairly consistent across the board. And that is something that we did not see in 2016, whereby the anti-Trump forces were divided between the people who didn't like Trump because he wasn't conservative enough, the people who generally supported Ted Cruz ultimately, and the more well-educated moderates who ultimately supported John Kasich. And you could never find one person of which those two separate ideological groups could sort of surround and sort of codify around. Versus right now, it seems like they've gotten mostly behind Ron DeSantis. So there's definitely this social psychology whereby, okay, and we often see this, right, sort of in elections with third-party candidates where it's like they never can seem to get too high because there's this fear that you're going to vote for a loser. So in this particular case,
the viability threshold.
Exactly. In this case, this viability threshold seems to be DeSantis has reached the viability threshold. We cannot have Trump again. So this is going to be the guy who can be able to sort of, bring together two potentially disparate parts of a coalition and actually make it whole. So I do think we're already seeing that, Chris.
If you could go back and show Republican voters in 2016 the January 6th footage, you could show them the end of the Trump presidency, you could show them that part. I assume that the granular distinctions between, well, I like Jeb on this, but really I'm more of a Rubio guy when it comes to that. But I do like Cruz on this. And the fallacy of choice phenomenon that gripped the Republican Party because they kept saying, we have so many great candidates. And they thought it was true, right? Scott Walker and on and on. Oh, we have so many great candidates. Which one of these good candidates will it be? Carly Fiorina, blah, 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 blah. And this time, well, my experience suggests that we don't make the same mistakes twice, but the mistakes that we make in the past lead to different mistakes the next time. So I'm looking at Ron DeSantis and I see Nikki Haley. I noted with interest, Nikki Haley goes out on the trail and she says Ron DeSantis is soft on sex ed. She thinks third grade is too young. Why does Ron DeSantis want to teach third graders about trans issues? I was like, whoa, hold on. We're getting started early. So the pressure on the B team, Pompeo, Pence is like A/B. We'll see. Just because he has so much name recognition as being the vice president and all of that stuff. But the target is on DeSantis, not Trump, right? The target is very much on DeSantis, not Trump. This would be sort of the way I think about it is in 2000, when George W. Bush emerges as sort of a consensus figure, almost in the way that DeSantis is. The Republican establishment likes George W. Bush, Andover, Yale, Harvard, son of the former president. Check. Okay, he's got the resume, and we can trust this guy. But Bush had spent so much time in Texas courting evangelical Christian voters who at that time were the ascendant part of the Republican Party. And so Bush has all of that. So here's John McCain, right? And I can't remember everybody who ran in 2000. I was a.
Would you like to try and guess some? We can
say Gary Bauer. We know
Gary Bauer, Liddy Dole, Orrin Hatch,
yes,
Alan Keyes, Dan Quayle. Kasich formed an exploratory committee.
You magnificent bastard! That is fantastic. That is good.
Lamar Alexander ran again.
Lamar exclamation point.
Correct.
With the checkered shirt.
Steve Forbes.
Oh, was Steve Forbes 2000?
Both him and Lamar ran both times.
Steve Forbes, what might have been in 96. What he got to host Saturday Night Live though. Okay, so McCain was getting the heat, right? So McCain, as he emerges and is going to run, he's getting he's trying to capture all this not Bush energy, and got close for a minute, but didn't get through. I know all of the ways that personally Donald Trump is not like George W. Bush. I know all the ways that Ron DeSantis is somewhat different than George W. Bush. But why? What? I'll put it this way. What is it about Ron DeSantis that could, and I'm not saying will, but could prevent him from getting eaten alive by ducks, right? What is it that will prevent him from eventually having to engage with the Nikki Haley's and engage with the Ted Cruz's or whomever?
So I think I think of things through numbers. And what I know about the 2000 field in 1999 was, first off, I love the analogy in terms of Bush sort of becoming this consensus guy, because he didn't start out that way. He became it over the course of the first half, and really the first half of the first half of 1999.
Do you want to know? And I'll just, as an aside, you want to know where it happened? It was in an Iowa voter forum, and the moderator was being very snarky, and all the guys were sitting in groovy chairs up on the stage, and there was an audience. And the guy said, what philosopher most influences you? And what he was clearly trying to just get them to say something crazy or be dumb. And they go through, and Bush with he's got his shoulder scrunch. He goes, Jesus, because he changed my heart. Boom. And it was like, that's the guy. There you go.
So good. So good. But George Bush basically charted up and was basically, if I recall correctly, in the high 40s in the average of polling by the end of by June, July of 1999. The second person was actually Liddy Dole, which a lot of people don't remember, which was, Liddy Dole obviously was, a cabinet member. Her husband, obviously, Bob Dole, ran in 96, was the nominee. It's the third time Dole had run. Third time's the charm, I guess, just like for Joe Biden. And what ended up happening was Dole just couldn't go sort of the distance. And eventually McCain became the one who sort of took her place, right, with that campaign that was very much focused on New Hampshire.
And the media.
But the big difference is just look at where Ron DeSantis is in the polling. DeSantis is polling about a third of the Republican vote. That is a very rarefied company. And it's especially a rarefied company when you have somebody else who's polling north or around 40% of the Republican vote on average. And I think ultimately what happens is you get back to that social psychology part of the equation, is these folks are going to have to make their mind up, which is, if it's not Trump, who is it? We don't want to be split. This isn't like, the way you might say it is, if we run the Republican primary again in 2008, after Bush won a first term in 2000 and then lost re-election in 2004. This is a very different situation, right, where sort of the memories of the past are sort of coming alive in people's heads. I ultimately think, obviously, like in past years, if you're looking for a surprise, Iowa has tended to elevate, social conservative candidates, whether it be Ted Cruz in 2016, whether it be Rick Santorum in 2012, whether it be Mike Huckabee in 2008, whether it be, although I wouldn't necessarily consider him in the same social conservative sort of sphere, whether it be Bob Dole in 1988 and Pat Robertson in 1988, right?
Certainly Pat Robertson. And, it's interesting for the Republicans. You've got me thinking about something, as you always do. So the Mike Huckabee of 2008 was, populist to some degree, right? He was certainly had the fair tax and some of that stuff. And he was one of the first candidate, and being the former governor of Arkansas, talking about opioid addiction. So he had some of that populist messaging, certainly, but he was running as he went to Wichita Bible College. He was running as a heart first evangelical Christian of the old model, of the old understanding. If you listen to his daughter, who is now the governor of Arkansas, and listen to her talk, and listen to a lot of people in what we thought was the evangelical space, it's really culture war, right? It's really not social issues.
Cultural conservative.
Yeah, it's really Tucker Carlsonian kind of, you need more sun on your testicles kind of stuff over there. There's a lot more of that stuff going on. I wonder how Iowa responds, right? I wonder, because it's a different Iowa and it's a different Republican Party, certainly than it was when Ted Cruz won.
It is. And, that. So I think there are a few things going on there. One is I always remark in my own head that Trump figured out that the way you sort of win with the, what failed for Pat Buchanan, what failed for Mike Huckabee, what failed for Rick Santorum was Trump sounds a lot like them on a lot of different issues, except you take out the religiosity. And then you're able to connect and you're able to expand the sort of base of that particular group. And you can actually win over some people in New Hampshire, for example.
Right. You can win Roman Catholic voters. You can win non-religious voters. You can get those people who are not attached to mainstream Protestantism or evangelical churches.
Exactly. And I wonder what will happen in Iowa. And the answer is, I don't know. And we haven't had a lot. We've had some, sort of interest group polling there, stuff that I would like to see verified by some other things. But we don't know exactly what the Iowa electorate will look like. What we do know is it does seem, interestingly enough, that New Hampshire, which, in all honesty, probably is the reason that Trump became president. Because remember, Trump comes out of Iowa, loses, comes into New Hampshire. The idea, of course, remember, was Marco Rubio had his 3-2-1 strategy. We're going to finish third in Iowa. We're going to finish second in New Hampshire. We're going to finish first in South Carolina. I don't know if it was ever an official strategy, but it certainly was a strategy that the press believed. And basically, of course, Rubio ran into a buzzsaw in New Hampshire debate known as Chris Christie. And then Trump easily wins in New Hampshire, and away we go. I think New Hampshire might actually be the harder state from this time around based upon the polling that I see, in part because Trump's coalition has changed. And that's, I think, something is not nearly discussed enough, Chris, which is that Trump was a candidate whose base was actually non-college educated moderate voters. In 2006, it was a group he did tremendous among. You could see it in New York. You saw it in the Acela primaries, right? And now his base is actually very conservative voters.
Yes, it was amazing to me. I think it was a Monmouth poll. I forget who did the poll, but when they broke out types of Republicans by support, the only group that Trump had the most support, that had majority support in, was very Republican or extremely the people who most strongly identified as Republicans. Trump had like 53% of those voters.
Exactly. DeSantis tends to do better among independents who lean Republican. I will say, as I was looking over those crosstabs and sort of comparing different crosstabs, I do think that there is movement for a candidate who can appeal to the Kasich wing. I do think that.
Well, and isn't that? And here's my view. There is no getting to the right of Ron DeSantis, right? Nikki Haley's on a fool's errand. You're not going to get to the right of Ron DeSantis, because to the right of Ron DeSantis on culture war is Donald Trump, right? And you're not going to jump both of those things. But there's obviously a big lane for, and this is where the left-right terminology sort of breaks down a little bit, because you can be a conservative who's not a nationalist. You can be a nationalist who's not a conservative. But for conservatives for both conservatives and moderates, there's plenty of room outside of DeSantis, right? There's lots of space there. There's lots of voters. You describe them as Kasich voters. We look at Larry Hogan. We look at Chris Sununu. But successful governors with a more sort of humane approach to cultural issues and who are less vitriolic. And then I look over here. I see Brian Kemp. I see some others who could appeal to conservatives in a way that DeSantis can't. DeSantis has a problem with conservatives because the nationalism jazz and the anti-corporate stuff and all of those things are a turnoff to some traditional conservatives. So there's space over there. But the question I think we're wrestling with here is, what will be the willingness of those voters?
Yeah, to take a
chance on somebody, especially if what they end up doing is blowing up Ron DeSantis and ending up with Trump again. Is Mitt Romney basically saying, eat it? You're going to have Ron DeSantis as your nominee, so shut up.
Yeah, I think we'd rather ride and die with DeSantis than, kick this open. And I think that ultimately may be the thing. Look, if you look at polling, as I like to do, historically speaking, we know that less than 5% of the nominee or people who poll less than 10% of the vote, less than 5% of those folks who are in that 0 to 10% category, which is everybody but DeSantis.
Right. I love the
Trump
differences.
at this point.
Well, she got a bump. She's up to 7. Well, I don't know. 5 to 7. I don't know. Anyway, go ahead.
Less than 5% of those folks become the nominee. Versus if you're somebody who's between 20 and 35% of the vote, 40% of those folks become the nominee. And that's a huge difference. And it climbs ever higher. If you get in the Trump category, about 75% of those folks become the nominee.
So what are the chances? So we have a perverse incentive structure. Let's take somebody like Ted Cruz, who there is no appetite for Ted Cruz's candidacy, maybe even with Ted Cruz. But he's raised all this money. He has all these supporters. You have staff. Do you know the analogy that I like to make about candidates like this? The Tom Selleck phenomenon. Tom Selleck had a hit show with Magnum PI for 8 seasons. And
great chest hair.
The best in the business. You could hit a 7-iron off of that chest hair and leave him unscathed. But the problem was he couldn't do the movies that he was getting offered because he didn't want to break up the show and have Higgins, TC, Rick, Ice Pick, and everybody else lose their gigs because it was a wonderful show that they could go do in Hawaii. Larry Manetti. I own Larry Manetti's book, Aloha Magnum. It has also Italian recipes in it, which you may enjoy, La Cucina. But the problem that some of these folks have is when you start exploring a run for president and you start raising a little money, and in an era of super PACs and billionaires, right? Where it's like, well, I don't know. We're here. Like, if you're Mike Pence, how do you say, actually, I'm not going to run? Because then what you have to do is say, because I think Ron DeSantis is the guy. That's emotionally hard to do, but it's also hard to tell the people around you who want you to run that you should do it. And also, you are the former freaking vice president of the United States. Or if you're Ted Cruz, you were the runner-up the last time. Or everybody has a reason why they'd be better at this than Ron DeSantis, 44 years old, and the governor of Florida.
I would say a few things. One, the voters may make up their mind for them.
Right.
2, I'm always interested. VPs as nominees as eventually, winning a primary to be the presidential nominee of their party kind of have an interesting history. There's no doubt that it gives you a leg up, but there's also no doubt that there are plenty of VPs who fumbled and flumbled their way, right? So, Biden, yes, he became the nominee in 2020. Eventually, that wasn't in 2016. Cheney didn't even bother running. Gore was an easy in, the easiest of all time. But
H.W. Bush, that was a pretty.
But Gore won all 50 states. He knocked everybody out. He was polling about 50% at this point. But Quayle didn't run in 96 and then basically got laughed out in 2000. So, and remember also Mondale, even though he did become the nominee, actually really go all the way against Gary Hart. So it's not always so easy. And so, but I do think ultimately we don't give the voters enough credit, whether that be on, issues in general elections, or whether it be in primaries. Voters aren't stupid. They're going to look at the same numbers we're looking at. They're going to get a pretty good idea. And at this particular point, Mike Pence has, if you look at the polling, sort of limited support, and I think has a fairly low ceiling because of how Republican voters interpret what occurred at the end of the Trump presidency.
Yes. For good or for ill. Yes. The other part, it's Pence's challenge is interesting because he was so doggedly loyal to Donald Trump for 5 years, right? He was, through the campaign, through everything, the broad-shouldered leadership of Donald Trump. And in fact, Pence's job was to go be an apologist often for Trump, right? To go to the normal world and say, well, it looks like what he's doing is insane or bad, but here's why it's actually really good. So he had to do that for all that time. Then, of course, it had no value to Trump, right? All of Mike, bye, see you later. You are not useful to me anymore, so I'll throw you away, and the people will come and try to hang you. So Pence, I think the path for Pence is one in which socially conservative voters, not culture warrior voters,
Correct.
that socially conservative voters say, we got it. We need our man. We need a man that we can trust. Now, the other thing that I wonder this cycle, character as an issue. Character as an issue. The biggest problem that Donald Trump had was not policy, because he had fungible policies. Person of low character, right? He will do or say whatever he wants to do or say at any given moment, and lie or whatever he wants to do to get where he's going. His initial attacks on DeSantis, the groomer, showing pictures of DeSantis with girls at the high school where he used to teach, suggesting that he was up to no good, and that kind of stuff. Do you think that Republicans, having been burned by Trump, will they return to the kind of party that once had pause over George W. Bush's misspent youth?
Every action, blah, 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 an equal and opposite reaction, right? George W. Bush was successful in 2000 for many reasons, but one large part was because of who was the man who preceded him in the White House. And Joe Biden is right now the person in the White House. And yeah, you try and hook up things with Hunter Biden and blah, blah, blah. But the complaints about Joe Biden largely do not rest with his character.
No.
And that is the issue, which is, look, we know the polling always said that many of Trump's own loyal supporters didn't like that he was on Twitter until, 3 a.m. and doing this stuff. And they never liked, I think.
Hush money to porn stars was problematic.
Right. There was never, I think there was this great moment in the 2016 sort of primary after, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada. There was this debate. I don't know exactly. It might have been wherever it was in February. And Marco Rubio comes up and he is just getting into the gutter with Donald Trump during
I was there. It was a spectacle. Did not see Rubio as the genitalia discussing candidate, but there we were.
So I put up my hands.
And Trump could say, "Believe me, there's no problem. There's no problem.
No problem. It's all good." But that did not work for Marco Rubio. It simply didn't. And part of the reason I think it didn't work was because a lot of us thought that Trump was going places because of his bombastic attitude, when in reality, I think you could almost argue he was going places in spite of his bombastic attitude.
Or that the bombastic attitude was, if you accept Donald Trump as a performer or entertainer, right? Molly Ball, the great Molly Ball, was one of the first people to write it in the primaries. And I remember the moment, it was a moment of realization, which was, these people are having fun, right? The people who go to Trump's rallies are having fun. They play the hits. It feels exciting. It's not fun if you're me, penned like veal in the back of the auditorium with people yelling about the lying press. That's not a treat. But for the attendees,
absolutely,
it's a lot of fun. I mean, that's why they tailgate. There were no Jeb tailgates. And by the way, just as one aside here, a thing that has become clearer and clearer to me over time, Jeb Bush and his terrible candidacy and the awful strategic approach of, we're just going to raise $2 quadrillion and float here over the ether. What was the name of his super PAC?
Oh God, it was so funny. I was just thinking about this. I could look it up what it was.
But it was one of those awful, America Rising kind of whatever things. And we're going to
Right to rise.
We're going to just raise $1 billion, and then we'll come in and destroy everyone with money, and we're going to wipe out the field. just allowed resentments against Jeb Bush to build inside the Republican electorate, who was not excited about a third Bush as their nominee, and gave Donald Trump somebody to punch at. So, to bring it back to DeSantis, DeSantis right now is enjoying the benefits of candidacy. He won COVID, right? So which Republican had the best COVID? Ron DeSantis, because he became the foil, the national, as Democrats singled him out, and he singled himself out in fighting these fights over COVID. And then he followed it up with the Disney stuff and leaning in on trans issues. So Ron DeSantis has had all of this, but he hasn't had to engage as a candidate. What does history tell us, and what does your instinct tell us about what is the right time for DeSantis to jump? He's now said
earlier than later.
What does that mean?
So, okay, so let's take a look. There are two things. One, I don't want to forget on this particular thing. So I was coding last week when every single major candidate entered the race, and since 72. And I
love you, Harry Enten.
I was thinking to myself, I coded forming an exploratory committee as entering the race, because and what was so interesting when you bring up Bush's super PAC is I was like, what the hell is this? How do I code this? Because it's not an exploratory committee, right? It is, but it's sort of, but whatever. Either way, what I have found is that the median date in non-incumbent primaries was March 16th, I believe, of the year before. I also found that of the 17 non-incumbent races, 10 of the 17 were before the median candidate in the given year, 2 were the median candidate, and only 5 were after the median candidate. And the latest of those was Ronald Reagan in the 80 cycle, when he essentially formed a candidacy statement or whatever with the FEC.
But now wait a minute. Ronald Reagan had a significant advantage. He was running the whole time, right? And when from the moment that he released his delegates to Ford in 76,
correct,
his 1980 campaign was underway, and it was unmistakable.
Who was the second latest candidate to announce versus the median? I believe this is right.
Is this among Republicans or among all?
All.
Second latest to be the nominee. Who is the second latest to be the nominee?
And who announced like the second latest compared to the median candidate that year.
Going back to what year?
You don't have to go back that far.
Oh, really? Hillary Clinton?
No.
Who?
It's Joe Biden.
Oh, really?
Joe Biden. Remember, he did not really announce until, I believe it was like the April 22nd. Remember, Liz Warren was in that race on December 31st.
Right?
And you had Kamala Harris who was in. You had Bernie Sanders who was in February. He was about 45 days or so, if I recall correctly, after the median. And that's another candidate who had a lot of advantages that were already built in. People who universal name recognition, had run for president before or been vice president, although in the case of Biden, it was both. And that gives you an idea. You're better off announcing earlier than later because it helps you build name recognition. It helps you build a campaign apparatus.
But is DeSantis like Biden and Reagan, or is he like the rest of them? Does he have, is he in a structurally different place than these other people?
That's a good question. That I think it's a good question. But even in the case of Reagan, right, it was less than 90 days. So white knights generally don't work. I mean, we've had a few white knights in our day and age, whether it be Fred Thompson in 2008, whether it be Rick Perry in 2012. Those did not work out. I am not a believer.
Michael Bloomberg.
Great. Another perfect example.
People of Guam have spoken.
The people, right. I think it was American Samoa that he
was
won.
It the Samoans?
I believe it was the Samoans.
The Guamanians, they've always back a winner. The Samoans, they
you never know.
Blow with the breeze. You never know. I feel like there have been many comparisons to Scott Walker with Ron DeSantis.
I hate that comparison.
Tell me why.
Because when you look at the polls, it's just like looking at vanilla ice cream and looking at concrete. I mean, there's what's the comparison? The comparison is that one's got up to 15% of the national polls and the other one's at 35%.
Well, here's the comparison outside of polling. I certainly take your point on polling.
The governors.
Well, no, the governor who was Scott Walker's moment was in 2012 when he got recalled and decisively won his recall. And the Republican Party's national attention fixated on Wisconsin because of the protests and the unions, and he's busting government worker unions. And while that was happening, I hate the term establishment because it carries connotations that are not present anymore. But we'll say the Republican political class, right? The political professionals of the Republican Party start coming out for him, right? They start lining up like, okay, this is the guy. We're going to do it. We're going to get in for this guy. Bush people start showing up, and there's like, okay, whatever. And then when he starts running, it's a fizzle. And what Trump seems to be saying, and I'm not saying this is true, but what Trump and a lot of people are saying about DeSantis is he's low charisma. When he actually has to go run, that he won't be good. He's prickly. He doesn't care about people in that way, and it's hard for him to do that stuff.
Maybe. I mean, we don't know until people run, right? I mean, John Glenn was great resume going into 84 and then fizzled.
That's the part of this that has me so weirded out, which is we have a coalesced field into these two pools, right? So we basically have 40-40 and then 20% of the vote divided up a bunch of whatever. And not to call you all whatever, but you know what I mean. That if DeSantis cannot live up to the hype, it's going to be a problem, right? It's going to be a serious problem and all that stuff, which brings me to my final question on the Republicans, which is, how should Republicans be thinking about debates? If you could design for the Republican Party, and this is the week that they're continuing to take proposals from networks and from news outlets, what if you were a Republican, if you were Ronna Romney McDaniel, how would you be looking at this?
Okay, so I think that there are a few things to keep in mind. Number one, you have to ask the question, how large will the field actually get? And if you look in history, again, there are very limited examples where you have two candidates who poll 30% plus and two candidates whose total share of the vote totals in the 70s. And in all of those examples, the fields were very small. They were 5 or less. Now, I'm not saying
this is like Obama Clinton.
No, this is like Clinton Sanders, where 70, Gore Bradley, and the only other one was really Kennedy and
Reagan
Carter
Bush.
in 80. Reagan Bush didn't get to. Reagan was polling in the high 30s, if I recall correctly, and Bush was not up to that level. So very small fields. That doesn't mean that's going to be the case this time around, but I don't think we're going to be ending up with more than 10. I could be wrong. I wouldn't be surprised if we end up 7, 8, 9. Wouldn't be shocked by a 6 or 7. And if you can fit all of them on one debate stage, I think that sort of now all of a sudden you've got something. I think the other question is, what is the purpose of the debates? Secretly, what are you actually trying to accomplish in them? The big thing that Donald Trump had over the field in 2016 was his name recognition was very high, and he dominated the press, dominated it to the extent that I don't know if we never really saw before, and we haven't really seen since. And so the more debates will allow potentially for other candidates to get their recognition up. But at the same time, it could divide the anti-Trump vote. So I think it's ultimately, what are you actually trying to do with these debates? And I think that will sort of lead you on the course of how many you should have, what should be the format of them, so on and so forth.
Donald Trump, people may forget, for the first half of the debate calendar, Donald Trump laid back, right? He wasn't a particularly good debater in 2015, 2016. And he mostly was able to let Chris Christie take out before he took out Rubio, took out Rand Paul, and let these blow ups happen among these factions, and let that go on. before the, as he said, I keep moving towards the center. He said to Jeb Bush, I keep getting closer to the center of the stage and you keep moving out that way. By the time Trump was at center stage, he already had his wrecking ball, like that third to the, as you said, third to 2/5 of the Republican Party that was in his corner, which was enough for him. Okay, I have seen so many polls that talk about how unhappy Democrats are with Joe Biden. It is you could Washington Post very on the eve of the State of the Union, only 31% of Democrats want Joe Biden to be their nominee. And this is reflective of poll after poll after poll about low satisfaction among Democrats. My very rough read is that Joe Biden should have like 90% approval among Democrats, 90% of approval among Democrats, but he struggles to hit those numbers in his job approval numbers. He's not getting the kind of swack that he should be getting among Democrats, and there is this dissatisfaction. Is this people letting the perfect get in the way of the good? Is this that Democrats have not yet come to terms with that there isn't anybody else? Is this a mirage? What is this?
I think it's more of a mirage than anything else. Look, if Joe Biden decides that he wants to run for another term, and every indication that we have is that he has, in fact, pretty much made that decision, although, not official. So we'll see. I've seen more shocking things.
At this point, if Joe Biden were to make an early declaration that he was not running for president, it would be a big story.
It would be a huge story. So I think we got to separate two things out. One is Joe Biden's approval rating, and then two, what percentage of Democrats say they want him to be the nominee. And then within that second one, sort of how he'd stack up against the rest of the field, hypotheticals, blah, blah, blah. First off is that his approval rating among Democrats, depending on the poll you look at, is actually about 80 to 85. He's basically, in my mind, where he's supposed to be. And historically speaking, incumbents do not receive challengers unless their approval rating within their own party is in the low 70s or below. George H.W. Bush on the eve of the New Hampshire primary in 1992, as I believe it's 72%. Carter and Ford were in the 60s in 1976 and 80, respectively. And then Harry Truman and Lyndon Baines Johnson were, if my memory is correct, in the 50s or below on the eve of the New Hampshire primary in 52 and 68. And ultimately, both of them decided, you know what, we're not going to give it another go. That's not where Biden is. But interestingly enough, you bring up those polls that say you want Joe Biden to be the nominee, yes or no. Would you be satisfied if he were the nominee? And he's well south of 50% among Democrats. And those are two very different things.
If you say to all of our listeners, okay, guys, we're Diet Cokes for everybody. Diet Cokes for everybody. Everybody's like, oh, Diet Coke. I don't know. Some people are thrilled, but people say, oh, Diet Coke kind of tastes like battery acid. Is there anything else going on
agree.
out there? And I say, wait a minute, guys. Why is Harry making everybody get Diet Cokes? Who wants something else? We want something else.
Yeah.
75% we want something else. Now, as long as I don't have to say what the something else is, right? Because as soon as I say, well, it's Diet Sunkist, people are like, gross, you hillbilly. That's disgusting. Why are you drinking that? So I'd like to remind people frequently that California is two things: the biggest Democratic state, and also the state that pays the least attention to this kind of stuff, right? So I think there are a lot of Democratic voters across the country that have not dialed in on this question in a serious way. It's certainly in the way that the Republicans, being the party out of power, that they have not, right? The Democrats have not engaged in this way, number one. And number two, Donald Trump, I think there is a direct correlation between the viability of Joe Biden as a Democratic nominee and the credible threat of the existence of Donald Trump. And Biden needs Trump, right? If Donald Trump today floated away on a Chinese balloon and was never heard from again, that Joe Biden, Democrats would feel a lot less obliged because something, I think, people tend to forget, even the people who are participating, speaking of social psychology. Parties choose their nominee with the other party's eventual nominee in mind, right? If you're when the Republicans were debating in 2016, they were debating who would be facing Hillary Clinton. They were thinking about Hillary Clinton the whole time, and it shaped who they were going to pick and how they were going to pick. A Democratic Party that was thinking about Ron DeSantis would function very differently than a Democratic Party that is credibly afraid of Donald Trump. They are actually credibly afraid of Donald Trump, and that helps Biden.
I think it does. I mean, Donald Trump has run for president 2 times before. He has won 2 primaries and 1 general election. He has lost 1 general election. So he's 3 for 4. The only guy that's beaten him is Joe Biden. More than that, I've looked at some of these polls that, place Biden up against other Democrats. He leads all those polls by 20 plus points, although he is south of 50%. But, it's like the candidates they put up against him are his vice president, are his secretary of transportation, folks who are not going to run. Bernie Sanders is not going to run against Joe Biden. Therefore, by default, he is the nominee. I'm sorry to say to Marianne Williamson, your chances of winning are not very high.
But her crystal power, you don't know. When the chakras get aligned, my friend, things happen. Now, if I'm Elizabeth Warren, though, so New Hampshire's going to have its primary because it's New Hampshire. And the Democrats can choose to sanction or punish or whatever. But the primary is going to take place. Now, it will be irresistible to someone other than Marianne Williamson, right? To say, I don't know, maybe I'd like to do this. Now, it may just be nominal. It may just be notional. It may be like, what's his name, who ran against Trump? He was a former Massachusetts governor who then ran as a libertarian.
Bill Weld.
Yes. Yes, there could be somebody like that, right? That the former governor of Montana or somebody shows up to say, I'm going to take on Joe Biden. And then I want to talk about the metric system, Link Chafee. That there could be some of that, but somebody's going to do it, right? Somebody's going to do it.
Maybe, by the way, I have to drop it in, the fact that I would not have thought when I was following the 2006 Rhode Island Republican senatorial primary.
Laffy Chafee, baby.
Link Chafee. And that his opponent in that primary was a mayor in Rhode Island, Steve Laffey, who is actually running. He is running on the Republican side this year. I get his PR emails occasionally.
Steve Laffey, the author of the book Primary Mistake, which was I traced as the moment in the breakdown of the Republican Party. That is like, he didn't start it, but that was the first biggest crack when that popped wide open in Rhode Island, and Rhode Island Republicans were like, yeah, well, I don't know why we need the popular, I don't know why we need this Lincoln Chafee guy, son of John Chafee. Let's explore this. And that Link Chafee had to disavow Bush. I wrote in his father, all of that jazz was really a preview of what would happen to the Republicans in the Senate over the following 15 years.
Now you're bringing me back to my elementary and high school days.
You were a wild kid, Harry. You were a wild kid, living it up, getting a New York system wiener in Providence and living the good life. Okay, so
just to quickly say, I would just add, I don't think if you're a Democrat, you want to end up where Julian Castro ended up, which was, or Bill de Blasio, which was, you got on such the bad side of Joe Biden that you basically ended any chance you had of joining the administration, any chance you had going forward in politics. Remember the difference between a Buttigieg. Now, Buttigieg did much better in the primary than Castro did. But the fact was that Biden was more than happy to bring Buttigieg into his administration versus Castro. You don't hear anything from except for the occasional barb on Twitter. And that, I think, is an ultimate fear of any Democrat who wants to take on Biden, is that he's very likely going to be the nominee, and you challenge him in any form of fashion at your own peril.
I'm watching you, Liz Warren. I think you're right. I agree with you in the main, but it will depend on, there's a lot of, as they would say, there's a lot of football to be played between now and October, and we will see. And last thing before I let you go, so the Republicans have the best Senate map I think I've ever seen coming up for 2024.
Pretty good one.
It's really like it's better than the map they had in 14. It's like real good.
The math is also easier.
Yeah, the math is a lot easier. They don't need much. Joe Manchin has a hard decision to make, and so does Tester, and they've got Sherrod Brown. They've got retirements. It is very tough. Do you think that Republicans have learned the lessons requisite from their debacleous 2022 primary nominating process to think anew and act anew?
Well, the answer is, I'll give you the cheap answer, which is I don't know, but I will give you a historical note, which is in 2012, this same map came up. Not, obviously the states are sort of, different, and, the presidential vote, some of these states are much more red than they were, or blue in a few cases. But the 2012 map comes up. I thought Republicans were in pretty decent shape coming into it.
Missouri, Indiana.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this came after 2010, where they nominated some candidates that I thought were subpar relative to the other nominees they could have made. Delaware, for example, I think most predominant in my mind, where they decided to nominate, instead of Mike Castle, Christine O'Donnell.
Oh, yes.
And 2012 comes up, and what do? They nominate Todd Aiken.
Sure did.
They nominate Richard Murdoch. And you just go, oh my God, they did it again. Now, I don't know, based on that year, how that year kind of shook out. It might not have it probably didn't matter in the end.
I think it mattered in Missouri, and I think it mattered in Indiana.
Correct. But it mattered in those states. And if you're asking me, as we sit here, more than a year and a half from the election, that Republicans will have learned the lesson of 2022, I cannot say that. They could definitely do it again. But remember, Republicans need to pick up, assuming that Joe Biden wins, which incumbents win more than not, but far from a guarantee. They need to pick up a net gain of 2 seats. 2. You have West Virginia and Montana, states that Biden lost by 15 plus points, or about 40 points in the case of West Virginia, plus Ohio, a state he lost.
Plus Michigan with an open seat.
Correct. There are plenty of opportunities, but then you look at who Michigan chooses as the head of their state party, and you go, oh boy, I don't know. I really don't know.
Still high on their own supply. Okay, now the very, very last question. What is the best place to eat in New York City right now? What is your favorite? Give us some insight. As you, the best eating skinny person I know, give us a little insider tip on where to chow down in New York City.
I think it depends what you want. I have to be honest. I tend to be a very relaxed individual, and I like a quiet place with folks who are the age that I act. And I like an Italian joint that I haven't been to in a while, Canaletto, on East 60th between 2nd and 3rd, right near Bloomingdale's, which I just think has a very nice, good appetizer selection, good entree selection, and has wonderful desserts ranging from tartufo to a nice mixed berries with freshly whipped cream. And I tend to enjoy that very much. And I don't feel, like I've become, sort of gluttonous when I eat.
You don't have a Gandolfini energy as you're wrapping up.
That's correct. But there are other places that I certainly go to and enjoy, whether it be Shang Li, a Chinese restaurant on the Upper West Side.
Oh, I've been to Shang Li. That is very good.
Yes. And, even though I haven't been there nearly as much recently, my surrogate father, Noam, who owns the Comedy Cellar, has a nice little joint above above the Comedy Cellar, the Olive Tree Cafe, which I just enjoy. I think the atmosphere is good. And you know what? The food is actually pretty gosh darn good too. I do enjoy a good piece of salmon from there from time to time.
I don't think you should be shy about doing a New York dining guide. A dining guide and diet soda guide could be the next part of the Enten media empire. Harry Enten, anybody who doesn't follow you, anybody who does go on Twitter who doesn't follow you, anybody who's not enjoying your work currently on CNN, is there any other place that they should be getting you, that they should be receiving your wisdom?
Not really. I think you've covered it. Twitter, very occasionally, although I'm not as active as before, I make sure I write at least one column a week for the website. And on the air, you can catch me either on the morning program or you can catch me in the evening. You'll usually see me with my dear friend, Mr. Anderson Cooper, or Aaron Burnett in the 7 o'clock hour. And occasionally, you can even catch me on a panel in the 10 o'clock, but those tend to be the places that you'll see me most often.
It's always good, and you're always good to join us and very generous. And thank you so much for your time, my friend. Have a great day.
You know, I wish this were on a Friday, then I could say Shabbat Shalom, but I'm going to say good Shabbos anyway.
Well, and a happy. We're recording this on Shrove Tuesday on Mardi Gras, so I say a blessed Good Friday, or a blessed Ash Wednesday to you, sir. Well, that's it. Gentle listeners, we appreciate you, and we hope that we get to see a tanned, rested, and ready Jonah Goldberg back in our midst very soon. But until then, I'll see you next time.
No, you won't. This is my podcast.